In the 19th century, a woman deemed inconvenient had two primary destinations, the asylum or the convent. The line between the two was often little more than a whisper of holy water. For families of diminishing wealth and suffocating pride, the convent was the preferred choice. It was discreet, it was final, and it draped the act of social erasure in the holy vestments of piety. What happened inside those walls, however, was rarely spoken of. It was a transaction, not a salvation. Sound cue, a heavy iron gate slamming shut, the metallic clang echoing and fading. In 1868, in a cold, windswept mansion overlooking the Boston Harbor, the Vane family was facing a crisis. Their shipping empire, once the envy of New England, was bleeding dry, a casualty of the recent war and Marcus Vane's own reckless speculations. The furniture in the grand parlor was covered in white sheets, not to protect it from dust, but to hide the fact that much of it had already been sold. All that remained was their name, and that name was being threatened, not by creditors but by their only daughter, Elara. Elara Vane was 20 years old, and in the estimation of her father she was a catastrophe. She was not frail or delicate or porcelain. She was tall, she was broad, and she possessed a body that polite society deemed excessive. This, combined with an intellect she refused to hide and a quiet defiance in her eyes, made her utterly unmarriageable. She was the living, breathing, 200-pound symbol of her father's inability to control his own house, and he would not abide it any longer. Before we go deeper, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? Elara Vane was a creature of sharp, unwelcome contrasts. In a house defined by its cold, maritime austerity, she was a point of stubborn, fleshy warmth. In an era that demanded women be silent, decorative ghosts, Elara was unavoidably present. Her mother, Beatrice, was a woman who seemed fashioned from dried lavender and brittle lace, a creature of perpetual headaches and whispered anxieties. She would look at her daughter with a kind of baffled pity, as if Elara were a cormorant that had inexplicably hatched in a robin's nest. But Marcus Vane felt no such pity. He saw Elara's physical form not as a matter of constitution, but as a moral failing. It was, to him, a visible manifestation of her uncontrolled appetites, a gross indulgence that reflected poorly on his own discipline and bloodline. He was a man who equated control with survival, and his daughter was, in every sense, out of his control. He had tried. He had forced her into corsets that left bleeding welts on her ribs, hired tutors to teach her feminine restraint, and starved her on diets of weak broth and dry toast, all of which only seemed to make her quieter, sadder, and somehow larger in her defiance. The house itself was her first prison. She spent her days in the library, a room that smelled of leather rot and sea salt, reading books her father had forbidden, Whitman, Voltaire, and dark, Gothic romances that spoke of passions her world insisted she must never possess. She was intelligent, with a quick, mathematical mind that could have saved her father's business, but he would sooner consult an astrologer than ask his gluttonous daughter for financial advice. The campaign to marry Elara off had been a disaster from the start. It was not the grand parade of 40 suitors that some less fortunate daughters endured. Marcus Vane's pride would not allow for such public failure. Instead, it was a series of curated, claustrophobic dinners, each one ending in a more profound humiliation than the last. Young men from good families would arrive, their expressions carefully neutral, and spend the evening directing their conversation exclusively to Beatrice or Marcus, their eyes sliding off Elara as if she were a piece of oversized, poorly placed furniture. They spoke of the weather, of shipping manifests, of the lingering tensions from the war. They ate Beatrice's meticulously planned, meager courses. And through it all, Elara would sit, her back aching from the vice-like grip of her corset, her hands clenched in her lap until her knuckles were white. The final attempt was a man named Mr. Alastair Finch, a widower from Providence with a sprawling wool business and cold, assessing eyes. He was Marcus's last hope, a man who needed the Vane name to launder his new money. The dinner was agonizing. Elara, desperate to please, tried to engage him in a discussion of textile tariffs. For a moment he seemed surprised by her knowledge. But then, as she leaned forward to pass the salt, a seam in the back of her watered silk dress, already strained to its breaking point, gave way with a sound like tearing canvas. A sharp, definitive rip that echoed in the silent dining room. Finch froze. His gaze dropped to her shoulder, then to her father. A slow, faint smile of contempt touched his lips. He dabbed his mouth with his napkin, excused himself from the table, and was gone within 5 minutes. The business alliance was dead. The silence that descended on the Vane mansion after Alastair Finch's departure was heavier and colder than the fog rolling in from the harbor. For 3 days, Marcus Vane did not speak to his daughter. He remained locked in his study, the smell of brandy and cigar smoke seeping from under the door. Elara, confined to her room, ate nothing. She did not weep. She felt only a hollow, bracing numbness. The rip in her dress had been more than an embarrassment. It was a verdict. On the 4th morning, her father summoned her to the parlor. The white sheets were still draped over the ghosts of departed chairs, and the room was freezing. Marcus Vane stood by the window, staring out at the gray, churning water. He did not turn when she entered. "Your mother and I have made an arrangement," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "It is clear you are not suited for conventional life. Your passions are too strong for a civilized household." Elara felt her stomach clench. "Father, we have secured you a place at the Abbey of the Silent Vale. It is a convent on an island off the coast of Maine. The sisters there are renowned for their ability to instill discipline. You will learn piety, humility, and control." He framed it as a spiritual opportunity, a retreat for her own soul, but Elara heard the truth beneath the words. This was not a retreat. It was an exile. This was the asylum draped in a crucifix. "No," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. "I will not go." Marcus Vane turned, and for the first time Elara saw the full, unadulterated hatred in his eyes. "You will go," he said, his voice like chipping ice. "You are a blight on this family. You will be erased, Elara. You will go, or I will have you committed to Danvers as insane. The choice is yours." The journey north was a portrait of silent, abject misery. Elara was given 1 hour to pack a single trunk, which her mother inspected, removing a treasured book of poetry and a small, painted portrait of her grandmother. "These are vanities," Beatrice whispered, her hands trembling as she avoided her daughter's eyes. "You will not need them where you are going." The carriage ride to the northernmost port in Maine took 2 days. Elara sat opposite her father, the silence between them thick and suffocating, broken only by the rattle of the carriage wheels and the snap of the driver's whip. Marcus read a ledger, his face a mask of cold commerce, as if he were transporting cargo, not his own child. They arrived at a desolate fishing village just as a winter storm was brewing. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise, and the wind carried the sharp, stinging smell of brine and rotting fish. A small, sturdy ferry named the Pennants was waiting. Her father did not accompany her to the dock. He handed her trunk to the ferryman, a grim, silent man in oilskins, and then turned to Elara. He pressed a small, velvet pouch into her hand. It was not money, it was a silver rosary. "Do not write to us," he said. "Do not disgrace our name further, become invisible, pray for your own redemption." He turned and walked back to the carriage without looking back. Elara stood alone on the splintered dock, the wind whipping her hair across her face, and watched the carriage disappear. The ferryman grunted, motioning her aboard. As the boat pulled away from the shore, she looked out at the churning, iron-gray sea. Ahead, barely visible through the sleet, was a dark, jagged shadow on the horizon. Black Rock Island, her new home. Black Rock Island was less an island and more a fortress of granite thrusting from the icy Atlantic. It was perhaps 2 miles long, treeless, and perpetually battered by wind. The Abbey of the Silent Vale stood at its highest point, a severe, imposing structure of gray stone that seemed to grow organically from the rock, its single bell tower piercing the sky like a broken spear. There was no harbor, only a treacherous stone jetty where the ferryman tied up, tossing Elara's trunk onto the slick rocks with practiced indifference. 2 nuns, their faces completely obscured by heavy black veils that fell to their chests, were waiting. They did not speak but simply gestured for Elara to follow. The path to the Abbey was steep, a staircase carved into the cliffside, and the wind shrieked, threatening to pull her from the narrow steps. The air was so cold it burned her lungs. The nuns moved with a swift, unnerving grace, their black robes flapping like ravens' wings. They entered the abbey through a massive, iron-banded oak door that closed behind Elara with the echoing finality of a tomb. The interior was colder than the outside, and it smelled of beeswax, stale incense, and something else, a faint, sour smell like unwashed linen and old soup. She was led to an office, the only room she had seen that contained a fire. Before the hearth sat a woman. She was tall and skeletal, her face a topography of sharp angles and pale, translucent skin. This was Reverend Mother Agnes. Her eyes, the color of a frozen lake, examined Elara with an unnerving lack of judgment. It was the look of a craftsman examining a piece of flawed raw material. "Elara Vane," Agnes said, her voice a dry rustle. "Your father has paid generously for your education. Here we have only 3 rules. You will work, you will be silent, and you will obey. Your old life is dead. Your name is dead. From this moment you are nothing but a vessel to be emptied of sin." Elara's new life began with the stripping of her identity. Her fine silk traveling dress, now damp and stained with salt spray, was taken from her, along with her trunk and everything in it. She was given the uniform of a novice, a single, shapeless shift of undyed, abrasive wool, wooden clogs, and a thin, gray-white veil that covered her hair but not her face. The wool chafed her skin raw within an hour. She was assigned a cell, which was not so much a room as a stone alcove in a long, unheated dormitory. Her bed was a wooden plank with a single, straw-filled mattress and 2 thin blankets. The cell was barely wide enough for her to lie down, and not long enough for her to stretch out fully. That first night, she lay shaking in the dark, the profound, unearthly silence of the abbey broken only by the distant crash of the surf and the sound of another novice weeping, a muffled, desperate sound that was quickly shushed from the darkness. The next morning, the bell tolled at 4:00 a.m. The novices, there were 30 of them, all young, all with the same hollow-eyed, haunted look, assembled in the chapel for 2 hours of prayer, kneeling on the frozen stone floor until Elara's knees were numb and aching. After a breakfast of thin, watery oatmeal and bitter black tea, the work began. It was brutal, relentless labor. Elara was assigned to the laundry, hauling massive, steaming vats of lye water, scrubbing coarse linens until her hands cracked and bled, and hanging the heavy, wet sheets in the freezing wind, where they froze solid like boards of ice. The silence was absolute. Speaking was forbidden outside of prayer and direct instruction. The nuns patrolled like shadows, communicating with sharp, clicking sounds or hand gestures. The other novices were ghosts. They moved through the suffocating routine with a practiced, automatic obedience, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on the floor. Elara, larger and stronger than most, found the physical labor exhausting but manageable. It was the psychological toll that began to break her. The silence, the cold, and the constant, gnawing hunger. The food was meager, designed for starvation, not sustenance. Elara's body, accustomed to her father's punitive diets, was now plunged into a new realm of deprivation. She felt dizzy, weak, and perpetually lightheaded. But it was the complete isolation that was the true torture. She was surrounded by 30 other women, yet she had never felt so profoundly alone. She tried once to catch the eye of a young novice in the refectory, a girl with pale red hair and a spray of freckles, offering a small, desperate smile. The girl's eyes widened in sheer terror, and she looked away, crossing herself as if Elara had tried to curse her. Elara realized that connection was the ultimate sin here. The Abbey was not designed to save their souls. It was designed to annihilate their personhood. She tried to write a letter to her mother, a desperate plea for rescue, scribbling on a piece of packing paper she'd found in a storage room, using a piece of charcoal. She had no way to send it, but the act of writing it felt like breathing. She hid it under her straw mattress. That night her cell was searched. A tall, gaunt nun, Sister Honora, found the note. She did not read it. She simply held it before Elara's face, then handed her a bucket and a brush. Her penance was to scrub the entire length of the dormitory's stone floor on her hands and knees with ice-cold water. It took her until the 4:00 a.m. bell. She was learning. This was not a prison you could escape. It was a grave you inhabited. After 2 months, Elara's body had changed. The punishing labor and starvation rations had stripped weight from her, leaving her gaunt in the face, her clothes hanging loosely. But the nuns still looked at her with suspicion, as if her very frame was an insult to their asceticism. Reverend Mother Agnes, in particular, seemed to watch her with a cold, calculating interest. Elara was moved from the laundry, her hands now a map of scars and calluses, and reassigned to the Abbey's bleak and windswept gardens. The gardens were not for beauty, they were for survival. They grew potatoes, turnips, cabbage, and in a separate, walled-off section, a vast array of herbs for the Abbey's infirmary. This herb garden was tended by Sister Honora, the same gaunt new who had found Elara's letter. But the gardens were also the domain of one other person, the only man Elara had seen on the island. He was known only as Thomas. He was the Abbey's groundskeeper, boatman, and general laborer, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s with a thick, untamed beard and the same haunted silence as the novices. He lived in a stone shack by the jetty and was forbidden from entering the Abbey proper, just as the novices were forbidden from speaking to him. He was a phantom, existing in the periphery, digging graves in the small cemetery, mending the stone walls, and sailing the penance to the mainland once a month for supplies. He was an outcast, just as she was, and Elara found her eyes drawn to him, this other breathing human thing in a world of cold stone and whispering ghosts. Sister Honora, it turned out, was the Abbey's apothecary. She was a woman of terrifying, skeletal piety who seemed to subsist on prayer and bitterness alone. Her herb garden was her kingdom, and she guarded it with a zealot's passion. Elara's new job was to weed, to dig, to harvest, and to carry the heavy baskets of herbs to the infirmary drying room. She learned to identify dozens of plants, lavender and chamomile for calming, willow bark for pain, and others she did not recognize, dark, leafy plants with bitter smells. Sister Honora watched her constantly, her eyes missing nothing. "The body is a sinful vessel, novice," Honora hissed at her one afternoon, catching Elara pausing to rest her aching back. "It cries with hunger, it burns with illicit warmth. It is the garden of the devil. We must uproot it, salt the earth, until only the soul remains." Elara learned that Honora provided all the novices with a daily tonic, a bitter, dark green liquid served with their morning oatmeal. It was meant for spiritual clarity and the suppression of carnal humors. Many of the novices, Elara included, found their monthly courses ceased entirely after arriving at the Abbey. Honora called this a blessing of purity. But Elara, working in the herb garden, began to recognize the plants that went into that tonic. She saw pennyroyal, tansy, and other herbs she'd read about in forbidden books, herbs used by country women to prevent conception or to end it. She realized with a chill that Mother Agnes's control was not just psychological, it was chemical. They were being systematically drugged, rendered sterile and docile by the daily blessing from Sister Honora's garden. Elara's work in the garden brought her into proximity with Thomas. They were never left alone, as Sister Honora or another nun always patrolled the perimeter, but they worked on opposite ends of the same cold, potato-filled field. He worked with a rhythmic, powerful intensity, his shovel rising and falling, turning the rocky soil. He never looked at her. He never spoke. But his presence was a disruption, a tear in the Abbey's seamless, female-only world. He was a reminder of the life that had been stolen from her. The novices were terrified of him, whispering that he was a murderer or a madman given to the Abbey by his family in place of a prison sentence. But Elara watched him. She saw him, one freezing afternoon, pause his digging to place a small, dead sparrow on the stone wall. He covered it with a few leaves, a tiny, futile burial. It was an act of tenderness so profound, so out of place in that brutal landscape, that it struck Elara to the core. He was not a monster. He was a prisoner. One day, while harvesting turnips near the wall that separated the vegetable garden from the sea cliff, Elara's numb fingers fumbled, dropping her small gathering knife. It skittered across the dirt and fell through a crack in the stone wall, landing on the path below where Thomas was clearing brush. She froze, terrified. Getting a nun for help would mean a penance for her clumsiness. Thomas, seeing the knife, paused. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were not cold or mad. They were just tired. He glanced left and right. No nuns were visible. He quickly picked up the knife, and instead of passing it back, he tucked it into his own belt and continued working as if it had never happened. He had covered for her. It was the first act of human kindness she had experienced in months. A week later, a new novice arrived on the penance. She was a girl from a wealthy New York family, younger than Elara, perhaps 17. Her name was Clara. Unlike Elara, who had arrived in a state of numb despair, Clara arrived with a furious, terrified energy. She was not resigned, she was a caged animal. She refused to be silent, screaming and crying for her mother during the first night's vespers. She was dragged from the chapel. The punishment was swift. Elara, working in the laundry, a temporary reassignment, saw Sister Honora and two other nuns haul Clara to the penitent's cell, a small, windowless stone shed behind the kitchen. Elara heard the sounds from that shed for 2 days. At first it was screaming and pounding, then it became sobbing, and then silence. When Clara was finally released and returned to the dormitory, she was unrecognizable. Her bright, defiant eyes were now dull and vacant. Her body moved with the same shuffling, automatic obedience as the others, but the change was too sudden, too complete. Elara, haunted by the girl's transformation, watched her closely. Clara was now given the most menial tasks, endlessly scrubbing the same patch of floor, her lips moving in silent, frantic prayer. Elara realized this was what the Abbey truly did. It didn't just demand obedience, it manufactured it. It took inconvenient women and, through hunger, labor, isolation, and Elara suspected Honora's chemical tonics, it broke their minds. It returned them to their families as perfect, hollow dolls, or it kept them here as permanent, mindless servants. She wondered with a sickening lurch which fate her father had paid for. The incident with the knife had forged an invisible, dangerous thread between Elara and Thomas. They began to communicate, a secret language of shared glances and small, hidden gestures. He would leave a single, perfect potato by the stone wall for her, which she would hide in her shift and eat later in her cell, the raw, earthy taste an explosive, illicit pleasure. She, in turn, stole a small bar of lye soap from the laundry and left it for him near the boathouse. It was a pathetic, childish exchange, but it felt as monumental as a declaration of war. It was a shared we against the they of the Abbey. Elara was becoming reckless, driven by a starvation that was more than physical. She needed to know another human being saw her. One afternoon, while sorting herbs for Sister Honora, she found herself alone in the infirmary's drying room for a few precious minutes. She stole a piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper. That evening, on her way back from the garden, she slipped the note into the same crack in the wall where her knife had fallen. It contained only one word: why. The next day it was gone. In its place was a small, flat stone. Scratched onto its surface was a single word: debt. He was an indentured servant working off a family debt. He was trapped here just as she was. This knowledge changed everything. He was not her keeper, he was her fellow prisoner. The shared glances became more frequent, more desperate. They were two people clinging to a piece of driftwood in a frozen sea, and their shared humanity was becoming a dangerous, flammable thing. The harsh winter gave way to a brief, violent spring. The storms off the Atlantic were relentless, and the work in the garden became a daily battle against mud and ice-cold rain. Elara felt a change in herself. The hunger and labor had hardened her body, but the isolation and defiance had hardened her mind. She was no longer the frightened, weeping girl her father had exiled. She was a survivor, watchful and cunning. She had stopped drinking Sister Honora's morning tonic, pretending to sip it, and then spitting it out into the slop bucket when no one was looking. The effect was immediate. Within weeks, she felt her mind clear, as if emerging from a fog. Colors seemed sharper, her thoughts faster, and with this new clarity came a terrible, aching resurgence of her own body's rhythms, a reminder of her physical self that the Abbey was trying so desperately to erase. Her connection with Thomas deepened. It was no longer just about survival, it was about rebellion. The notes became more frequent. He told her his full name was Thomas Griffin, that his father had lost his farm and signed a 7-year contract with Mother Agnes for his son's labor to pay a debt. He had been here for 4 years. He too was a problem son, prone to drink and fighting, exiled by his family. The parallels were undeniable. They were the refuse of respectable society, hidden away on this rock. Their shared resentment of their jailers, Agnes, Honora, and the distant, cruel families who had put them here, grew into a fierce, unspoken bond. The danger of their communication was escalating. Sister Honora began watching Elara with a renewed, sharpened suspicion. Elara's newfound clarity, her subtle resistance to the docile state of the other novices, had not gone unnoticed. Honora seemed to sense that the medicine was no longer working. She would stand over Elara in the refectory, watching until Elara was forced to drink the bitter tonic, which she would then force herself to vomit up later in the latrine, a painful, secret ritual. One afternoon, Reverend Mother Agnes herself appeared in the garden, a rare event. She stood and watched Elara dig potatoes, her presence a physical weight, a judgment. "The Vane blood is stubborn," Agnes said, her voice a dry whisper. "Your father warned me you mistook defiance for strength. Pride is the root of all sin, novice, and you are choked with it. It must be burned out or you will rot from the inside." The threat was clear. Elara was failing her education. She was on the path of novice Clara, destined for the penance cell and a broken mind. The fear of that fate, of being hollowed out, pushed Elara toward an even greater recklessness. She and Thomas were no longer just communicating, they were plotting. They spoke in frantic, whispered bursts of the supply boat. Thomas was the only one who sailed it. He was planning to escape. He would not leave her. They would go together. The plan was insane, suicidal, but it was a pinprick of light in an endless, crushing darkness. They would leave on the next supply run, under the cover of the new moon. The boathouse was a small, dilapidated stone structure near the jetty, filled with the smell of tar, old rope, and drying salt. It was Thomas's domain, forbidden to all novices. 2 nights before the planned new moon, Sister Honora had cornered Elara, accusing her of stealing herbs from the infirmary. Honora had found the small pouch of dried willow bark Elara had saved for a headache. As penance, Elara was tasked with mending the torn fishing nets, a job usually left for Thomas. She was to do it in the boathouse, and Sister Honora locked the door from the outside, informing her she would be retrieved for morning prayers. It was a punishment meant to isolate her further, to expose her to the cold and damp. But it was a mistake, a terrible, wonderful mistake. Elara was alone, unsupervised, in Thomas's space. She worked for an hour, her fingers clumsy on the rough netting. Then she heard a sound, a scrape of wood on stone. A loose floorboard near the back wall was pushed aside, and Thomas Griffin pulled himself up into the room. He had a hidden entrance, a bolt hole from the cliffside. He had been using it to steal extra rations from the Abbey's stores. He froze when he saw her, believing he was caught. Elara froze, believing she was. They stared at each other in the dim, moonlit space. He was the first person she had been truly alone with in 6 months. The silence in the boathouse was absolute, save for the rhythmic crash of the surf outside. Thomas looked at her, his eyes tracing the hollows of her face, the raw, scarred skin of her hands. He was not the brute the nuns whispered about. In the moonlight, his face was etched with a profound, weary sadness. "They locked you in," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. It was the first time she had heard him speak more than a single word. "Yes, for penance." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Everything here is penance." He moved closer, and Elara did not back away. She should have been terrified. This was the ultimate sin. Discovery meant the penance cell or worse, but she felt no fear. Only a powerful magnetic pull toward this other living, breathing soul. He reached out, his hand rough and calloused, and brushed a strand of damp hair from her face. His touch was electric, a shock of warmth in her frozen world. "Elara," he said, the first time she had heard her own name in half a year. It was a reclamation. In that moment she was not novice. She was not her father's blight. She was Elara. He did not kiss her. It was something more desperate, more primal than that. It was a collision. A fumbling, frantic, clumsy act of rebellion, driven by 6 months of starvation, isolation, and dehumanization. It was not gentle or romantic. It was a desperate assertion of life in a place dedicated to death. It was two prisoners clinging to each other in the dark, stealing a moment of humanity before the executioner arrived. And it was over almost as soon as it began, leaving them breathless and terrified in the sudden, echoing silence. The aftermath was a cold, sickening dread. The reality of what they had done crashed down on Elara. This was not a small, stolen note. This was the unpardonable sin, the one thing Mother Agnes's entire system was designed to prevent. "My God," Elara whispered, pulling her rough wool shift back into place. "Thomas, if they find out." "They won't," he said, his voice urgent, already moving back toward the loose floorboard. "Honora locked you in. No one will know I was here. Go back to the nets. Pretend you were here all night." He paused, his hand on the floorboard. "The new moon, 2 days, be ready, I will come for you, we will go to Portland, we will disappear." He was gone. Elara was left alone in the boathouse, the smell of tar and salt now mingled with the scent of their transgression. She sat back down at the pile of netting, her hands shaking so violently she could not tie a single knot. She was no longer just a rebel. She was a fallen woman, in the most literal, damning sense. She thought of her father, and for the first time she felt a flash of bitter, triumphant hatred. She had become the very thing he feared. But that triumph was quickly swallowed by a wave of terror. She was trapped on an island under the control of a woman who broke minds for a living. 2 days. She had to survive for 2 days. Sister Honora retrieved her just before the 4:00 a.m. bell, her face a mask of cold disapproval. Elara, her eyes downcast, her face pale, looked, for all the world, like a novice properly chastened by a night of solitary penance. The next 2 days were a blur of heightened, agonizing tension. Elara moved through her duties in the garden and the infirmary like a sleepwalker, her mind entirely focused on the coming night. Every shadow seemed to hold a watching nun. Every click of Sister Honora's rosary beads sounded like a judgment. She avoided Thomas in the garden, a pantomime of obedience, but the air between them crackled. Then, on the morning of the planned escape, the supply run was postponed. A violent northeaster blew in, churning the sea into a white, impassable foam. The pennant was securely tied at the jetty, unusable. Escape was impossible. They were trapped. The storm raged for a week. The island was cut off. The tension in the Abbey became unbearable. The nuns, agitated by the break in their routine, became harsher, their punishment swifter. And Elara, trapped in the dormitory, began to feel unwell. At first she blamed the meager food, the anxiety. But this was a new sickness. A rolling nausea that greeted her every morning, entirely separate from the hunger she had grown accustomed to. She had stopped the tonic weeks ago. Her body was her own again, and it was betraying her. She recognized the sickness from hushed descriptions she had read, from whispered stories among her mother's servants long ago. She knew with a certainty that turned her blood to ice what was happening. The single, desperate act in the boathouse. The ultimate, irreversible consequence. She was pregnant. Elara Vane, the obese daughter her father had exiled for being unmarriageable, the novice whose passions were to be erased by hunger and drugs, was now carrying a child. The irony was so bitter it almost made her laugh. She was a walking, breathing catastrophe, a scandal that would destroy not only herself but Thomas. And it would bring the full, apocalyptic wrath of Reverend Mother Agnes down on them both. She had to hide it. But how? Her body, already a source of shame and scrutiny, would soon become a living testament to her sin. She tried to restart Sister Honora's tonic, stealing a bottle from the infirmary, hoping the herbs that prevented life might also end it. She drank the entire bitter draught, her hands shaking. It only made her violently ill, confirming her condition. She tried to induce a miscarriage through labor, lifting stone blocks in the garden until her back screamed, hauling buckets of water until she collapsed. But the nascent life inside her held on with the same stubborn, defiant grip that she herself had on the world. Weeks passed. The storm abated, but Thomas made no move. He too must know that attempting an escape with her in this condition was impossible. He avoided her eyes entirely, his face a mask of grim despair. Elara was utterly alone, trapped on a rock, in a body that was no longer just her own. She managed to conceal her condition for nearly 2 months. The shapeless, heavy wool shifts designed to obscure the female form were a grim blessing. Her constant, low-level nausea was dismissed by Sister Honora as spiritual weakness. But as her 3rd month approached, the subtle changes became undeniable. A faint swelling, a new exhaustion that labor alone could not explain. She fainted one morning during Vespers, a dead weight on the stone floor. It was the ultimate disruption. She was carried to the infirmary. Sister Honora, her face tight with irritation, began the examination. She pressed on Elara's stomach, her cold, dry fingers clinical. Elara lay on the cot, her heart hammering. Honora's prodding stopped. She pressed again, her eyes narrowing. A look of dawning comprehension, so profound, so utterly horrified, crossed her face. It was not anger, it was not pity. It was a look of absolute theological disgust, as if she had just uncovered a nest of snakes beneath a crucifix. "Abomination," Honora whispered, her voice shaking. She crossed herself, her eyes fixed on Elara's stomach. "You have brought filth. You have let the devil inside this holy house." She did not wait for Elara to dress. She grabbed her by the arm, her fingers digging in like talons, and dragged her from the infirmary through the silent corridors to the office of the Reverend Mother. Reverend Mother Agnes was reviewing a ledger when Sister Honora burst in, shoving Elara to her knees on the cold floor. "Mother," Honora breathed, her voice ragged with fury. "This creature, she has defiled this abbey, she is with child." The silence that fell in the study was more profound than any in the chapel. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Mother Agnes did not move. She did not look at Elara. She slowly, deliberately placed her pen back in its inkwell. She blotted the page. Then she raised her head, her frozen-like eyes fixing on Elara's face. Elara had expected rage, screaming, a sentence to the penance cell. She had expected a beating. She was not prepared for what she saw. Reverend Mother Agnes was terrified. It was a flicker, a momentary loss of her iron composure, but it was undeniable. A flash of pure, unadulterated panic. This was not the fury of a zealot whose sanctuary had been defiled. This was the cold, sharp fear of a businesswoman whose enterprise was about to collapse. Agnes's face instantly hardened back into its mask of control. "Who?" she demanded, her voice a whip crack. Elara, kneeling on the floor, her shift soaked from being dragged through the mud, felt a surge of her old, stubborn pride. They would break her, but she would not give them Thomas. She would not be the instrument of his destruction. "It was a miracle," Elara said, her voice shaking but clear. "Like the Virgin." Sister Honora struck her. The blow was sharp, the crack of her hand against Elara's face echoing in the study. "Blasphemer!" Honora shrieked. But Mother Agnes raised a hand, silencing her. Agnes stood and walked around her desk, circling Elara like a wolf. The panic was gone, replaced by a cold, surgical calculation. "A miracle," Agnes repeated, her voice soft. "You think you are clever. You think this defiance is a shield. Here, girl, we burn shields." She leaned down, her face inches from Elara's. "I do not care who it was, a demon, a fisherman, it matters not. What matters is the fact of it, the stain." She turned to Honora. "Find the man, find Thomas Griffin. He is the only possibility. Lock him in the boathouse until I am ready for him." Honora scurried away, and Elara's heart sank. She had not saved him. She had only delayed. Agnes turned back to Elara. "Your father paid me a great deal of money for a service," she said, her voice conversational, as if discussing a poor crop yield. "He paid me to take his problem and return it to him as a solution. A quiet, docile, obedient daughter, or if that failed, a permanent, silent resident of this abbey. He paid for erasure." She paced before the fire. "He did not pay for this." She jested at Elara's body with utter contempt. "This is a breach of contract." Elara finally understood. This was not a house of God. It was a business. It was a high-class, discreet dumping ground for the inconvenient daughters of the wealthy. The Vanes, the New York family of Novice Clara, they were clients. Mother Agnes's reputation, her entire livelihood was built on her product: silence, obedience, and above all, purity. Her chemical and psychological methods were her trade secret, but Elara's pregnancy was a devastating failure of quality control. It was proof that Agnes could not control the passions she was paid to extinguish. It was a visible, swelling, 9-month advertisement of her own incompetence. "Your father will demand his money back," Agnes mused, more to herself than to Elara. "The others, the patrons, if word of this gets out." She looked at Elara, her eyes hardening. "This cannot be hidden. This is not a novice who tried to escape. This is a plague. You cannot be broken and returned. You cannot be kept here as a success. And I cannot dispose of a vain daughter no matter how much her father might wish it. The risk is too great." She stared into the fire, a recurring symbol of both judgment and destruction, the orange light reflecting in her cold eyes. A plan was forming, one that was far more cruel than a simple murder or a lifetime in the penance cell. "You are a failure," Agnes whispered. "And failures," she said, turning back to Elara, "are always returned to their maker." The next 24 hours were a blur of calculated, cold-hearted preparation. Elara was locked in her cell, no longer a novice but a piece of evidence. She heard Thomas being dragged from the boathouse. She heard the sound of a brief, brutal beating in the courtyard, a dull, sickening thud of wood against flesh, and then silence. She never heard his voice. Through the small, barred window of her cell, she watched as Sister Honora and 2 other nuns marched him down to the jetty. The penance was waiting. The storm had passed. Elara watched, her knuckles white on the bars, as they forced him onto the boat. She didn't know his fate. Was he being returned to the mainland, to prison? Or was he being taken out to sea, a heavy stone tied to his ankles? She watched the small boat disappear over the gray horizon, and she felt the last piece of her old self break. The tiny, rebellious spark of hope was extinguished. He was gone. The father of her child, the only person who had shown her kindness, was erased. And she was next. She was alone, pregnant, and in the hands of a woman who saw her as a failed investment. Later that day, Sister Honora came to Elara's cell. She was not carrying a food tray. She was carrying a bundle of fabric. She unlocked the cell door and threw the bundle at Elara's feet. "Get dressed," she spat. Elara unfolded the fabric. It was her own dress, the fine, watered silk gown she had worn on the night Alistair Finch had walked out. The dress she had worn when her father had condemned her. It was wrinkled and smelled of cedar and disuse, but it was a relic of her former life. "I will not," Elara said, her voice hoarse. Honora slapped her again. "You will. The Reverend Mother commands it. You will leave this place as you came, a worldly creature stained by sin." Elara slowly, painfully pulled the dress on over her head. It was agony. The silk, once merely tight, was now suffocating. The seams strained. The bodice would not close over her newly full chest, and the waist, where her pregnancy was just beginning to show, was a band of pure torment. The dress, which had once symbolized her failure to be small enough for the world, now served a new, cruel purpose. It was a costume. It was Mother Agnes's proof of Elara's corruption, emphasizing the very sin it was meant to clothe. She was a living, breathing scandal, packaged for return. Reverend Mother Agnes herself escorted Elara to the jetty. It was not a quiet departure. Agnes assembled all 30 novices in the courtyard, forcing them to stand in the freezing wind and watch. It was a sermon delivered not with words but with action. Elara, in her strained, ruined dress, her hair uncombed, her face bruised from Honora's hand, was marched past the rows of hollow-eyed women. This, their silence screamed, is the price of defiance. This is the fate of the unbroken. Elara held her head high. She would not give them her tears. She would not give them her shame. She met the eyes of the pale, freckled novice she had once smiled at. The girl looked back, and for a fraction of a second, Elara saw something other than fear. She saw a flicker of awe. Elara was the monster, the abomination, but she was also the only one who was leaving. Agnes gripped Elara's arm, her fingers digging in, and pushed her toward the path. The walk down the stone steps to the jetty was a torment, the tight dress chafing her, the wind pulling at her. She did not look back at the Abbey, that gray stone prison that had been her home for nearly 8 months. She only looked forward at the gray, churning sea. The journey back on the penance was a new kind of torture. It was not Thomas who sailed the boat, but a grim-faced fisherman from the mainland village. hired by Agnes for the trip. He steadfastly refused to look at either of them, his face set in a mask of superstitious fear. Mother Agnes sat opposite Elara, her back rigid, her black robe stark against the gray sky. She did not speak for the entire 3-hour journey. She simply stared at Elara, her eyes filled with a cold, righteous fury. She was the architect of a perfect system, and Elara was the single, glaring flaw that had brought it crashing down. Elara was the evidence of her failure, and Agnes was now personally delivering that evidence back to its source, to cauterize the wound, to protect her reputation. As the mainland coast grew clearer, Elara could finally smell it, not the clean, dead smell of salt and rock, but the living, complex smell of pine, damp earth, and wood smoke. It was the smell of the world. It should have smelled like freedom, but to Elara it smelled only of a different prison, a new judgment. She was leaving the Abbey, but she was not free. She was a package, stamped with shame, being returned to her sender. The carriage ride from the Maine coast back to Boston was a silent, 48-hour ordeal. Mother Agnes had arranged for a private, enclosed carriage, a black funereal box on wheels. She did not want her failure seen by the public. They stopped only for fresh horses, eating dry bread and cheese in the dark, cold carriage. Agnes prayed constantly, her rosary beads clicking like insects, a relentless sound that drilled into Elara's skull. Elara, meanwhile, was trapped in the agonizing confines of her silk dress, her body aching, her mind numb. She was no longer Elara Vane, she was not novice. She was a nameless pregnant thing, an object of transaction between two ruthless authoritarians. As the carriage rumbled over the familiar cobblestones of Boston, her numbness began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp dread. She knew her father, she knew his pride. She had been a blight on him before. What she was now. She had no word for it. She was returning to a house that had cast her out, carrying a scandal that would give them the very justification they had always wanted to destroy her completely. The carriage stopped. They were outside the tall, iron gate of the Vane mansion. The house looked just as it had, cold, proud, and unforgiving. Reverend Mother Agnes did not send a servant. She did not knock politely. She exited the carriage, grabbed Elara by the arm, and pulled her up the Tone steps to the front door. She used the heavy brass knocker, the sound booming through the quiet, respectable street. 1, 2, 3 heavy thuds. Elara stood beside her, shaking, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the gaze of unseen neighbors from behind curtained windows. The scandal had begun. The door opened. It was not a servant. It was Marcus Vane himself. He looked older, his face thinner and etched with the permanent scowl of a man losing a long, private war with his own failures. He saw Reverend Mother Agnes, and his expression was one of confusion. "Reverend Mother," he began, "what is the meaning of this? I was not expecting." And then his eyes moved. They shifted from Agnes to the figure standing beside her. He saw his daughter, Elara. He saw her bruised face, her tangled hair. And then his gaze dropped. He saw the ruined silk dress, stretched and strained over the undeniable, impossible swell of her pregnancy. The color drained from his face. He looked for 1 second like a man who had been shot. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Mr. Vane," Reverend Mother Agnes said, her voice cutting through the frozen silence. It was not the voice of a supplicant. It was the voice of an aggrieved merchant. "We," she said, gesturing to the Abbey, "are a house of God. We dedicate ourselves to the curing of spiritual sickness, the taming of unruly passions." She then shoved Elara forward, forcing her 1 step across the threshold, into the foyer of her father's house. Elara stumbled, catching herself on the doorframe. "We do not," Agnes continued, her voice ringing with cold fury, "house the sins of the flesh. We do not harbor the corrupted." Marcus Vane stared at his daughter's body, his face a mask of purple-tinged, speechless horror. He looked from Elara back to Agnes, his mind clearly unable to process the scene. He had paid to have this problem removed, and here it was, returned and magnified into an unspeakable public ruin. "Your property is returned, sir," Agnes said, using the cold, commercial term. Her sickness was beyond even God's grace. "She is your shame, not mine. Our contract is void." She placed a small, leather-bound ledger on the entryway table, an itemized bill for Elara's time, minus her father's initial donation. Then, without another word, Reverend Mother Agnes turned, walked briskly down the steps, entered her carriage, and was gone. Elara stood in the foyer of her home. Marcus Vane was still frozen in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame. The silence was absolute. From the top of the grand staircase, her mother, Beatrice, appeared, drawn by the sound of the knocker. "Marcus, who is it?" she called down, her voice a thin, reedy wail. She descended the stairs, her hand on the banister. She saw Elara. Her hand flew to her mouth, a small, stifled cry. She saw her daughter's condition, and her eyes, which had always been watery with pity, hardened into something Elara had never seen before: disgust, pure, unadulterated revulsion. "You," Marcus Vane finally whispered, his voice trembling with a rage so profound it was almost silent. "You thing." He looked at her, not as a father, not even as a jailer, but as one would look at a piece of rotting meat left on his doorstep. "You have destroyed me," he said, his voice gaining strength. "You have destroyed this family, you have destroyed our name." Elara, exhausted, starved, and traumatized, found the last tiny ember of her defiance. "No," she said, her voice a low rasp. "You did, you sent me there." Her father's hand flashed out, striking her across the face, sending her crashing against the wall. "You will not speak," he hissed. "You are not here, you do not exist." Elara Vane was not taken to her old bedroom. She was not even taken to a servant's room. Marcus Vane, his mind now working with a cold, desperate clarity, grabbed her arm and dragged her up the main staircase, past her weeping mother, and up another, smaller, steeper set of stairs to the attic. The attic was a cold, dark space, filled with the ghosts of the Vane family's former glory. Discarded furniture, broken crates, and dressmakers' dummies stood like silent, judging witnesses. In the far corner was a small, windowless storage room meant for old trunks. It was there he threw her. "You will stay here," he said, his voice calm, which was more terrifying than his rage. "You will not be seen, you will not be heard. Dr. Bledsoe will be summoned. He is discreet." Elara knew Dr. Bledsoe. He was an old, cruel man who specialized in female hysterics and difficult private matters for wealthy families. "And when the problem is resolved," Marcus continued, "you will be sent to Danvers. This time I will sign the papers myself. You are truly mad, Elara. This proves it." He backed out of the room and shut the heavy wooden door. Elara heard the slide of a bolt, the grate of a key in a lock. She was alone again in the dark, her hand rest against her stomach. She had escaped the Abbey, but she had been returned to the prison that had created her. The historical record of Elara Vane ends there. In the Vane family ledger, her name is marked with a single, stark entry dated 1868, departed. There is no record of her admission to Danvers State Hospital. There is no birth certificate for a child born in that house. There is no death certificate. Elara Vane and the child she carried were successfully erased by her father, just as he had always intended. The Vane Shipping Company declared bankruptcy in 1870, and Marcus Vane died 2 years later, a ruined and bitter man. The mansion was sold to creditors, its contents auctioned off. Locals in Boston whispered stories for decades about the Vane girl, the daughter who was so scandalous she had been locked in the attic, but the truth was buried beneath layers of pride and shame. As for Thomas Griffin, his fate is even more obscure. No man by that name was ever registered in a Portland jail or asylum. It is most likely his debt was paid in the cold, deep waters of the Atlantic, his silence purchased forever by Mother Agnes. The silence, after all, was her true currency, the product she sold to the wealthy and powerful. And what of the Abbey of the Silent Veil? Elara's pregnancy, the failure that Mother Agnes so desperately needed to contain, was masterfully spun. It did not become a scandal that ruined her. It became a testament to her unyielding standards. The story, as Agnes told it to her patrons, was that she had discovered the Vane girl was already pregnant before she arrived. A fallen woman her father had tried to hide within the Abbey's sacred walls. Agnes, in her righteousness, had cast her out. Her reputation for purity and discipline was not only saved, it was enhanced. The Abbey of the Silent Vale continued to operate for another 40 years, accepting the inconvenient daughters of New England's elite, its gray stone walls holding its secrets, its bell tolling over the icy water. It was a perfect, closed system. The inconvenient were sent in, and only the broken, the silent, or the dead ever came out. Elara's story is a whisper, a footnote in a forgotten ledger, a testament to a time when a woman's body was a battlefield, and her mind was a territory to be conquered, broken, and controlled. And the most haunting part, no one ever looked for her. If you want more dark historical stories like this, subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America and keep the past from being erased.